The champagne cork popped like a gunshot in Uncle Richard's dining room, and I watched my cousins raise their glasses in what they called a celebration toast. What were they celebrating? The fact that I'd just lost everything I thought my grandmother Dorothy had left me. The laughter felt like nails on a chalkboard as Jessica clinked her glass against Brad's, both of them grinning like they'd just won the lottery. In a way, I guess they had. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Grandma Dot's funeral had been 3 days earlier, on a crisp October morning when the maple leaves matched the color of her favorite autumn cardigan. The whole town of Riverside seemed to turn out for Dorothy Mitchell's service. She'd been the heart of our small Ohio community for 78 years, the woman who organized the annual Harvest Festival, who made sure every family had a Thanksgiving dinner, and whose prize-winning roses had graced the cover of the local garden magazine more times than anyone could count. The church overflowed with people whose lives she'd touched, from the mayor to the checkout girl at Morrison's grocery who Grandma always asked about by name. I sat in the front pew between my father Tom and my Uncle Richard, trying to focus on Pastor William's words about Grandma's generous spirit and community dedication. But I kept glancing at the small wooden box that held her ashes, remembering how just 2 weeks earlier she'd squeezed my hand from her hospital bed and whispered, "Sarah, honey, you're going to be just fine. I've made sure of it." Her eyes had that knowing twinkle they always got when she had a secret, the same look she'd worn when she surprised me with a bicycle for my 10th birthday, or when she'd quietly paid for my college textbooks without telling Dad. The whole family had expected the will reading to be a formality. Everyone knew Grandma's house on Maple Street was worth close to $300,000, a fortune by Riverside standards. The Victorian had been in the Mitchell family for 4 generations, with its wraparound porch and the garden that was practically a local landmark. Uncle Richard had been talking for months about his plans to sell it and split the proceeds, referring to it as the family inheritance like it was already his. He'd even started bringing real estate agents by during Grandma's final weeks, claiming he was just getting estimates for insurance purposes. The morning of the will reading, I drove Dad to the office of Parker and Associates, the law firm that had handled Grandma's affairs for 20 years. Mr. James Parker was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who'd known our family since I was little. His office smelled like old books and coffee, with degrees and certificates covering the wood-paneled walls. Uncle Richard arrived with Aunt Linda, both dressed like they were attending a business meeting rather than settling their mother's final wishes. My cousins Brad and Jessica followed, and I caught them whispering about vacation plans and car payments. Mr. Parker cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses before opening the manila folder that contained Grandma's will. The document was surprisingly short, just 2 pages of legal language that basically said the same thing everyone expected. The house, the savings account, and all personal property would be divided equally among Grandma's 3 children: Dad, Uncle Richard, and Aunt Susan, who lived in California. The family business, a small antique shop downtown, would go to Uncle Richard since he'd been helping run it. There were small bequests to various charities and the church. My name wasn't mentioned once. I felt the words hit me like cold water, but I kept my expression neutral. Of course Grandma would leave everything to her children. That made perfect sense. I'd never expected anything beyond maybe some of her jewelry or a few family photos. But Uncle Richard's reaction caught me off guard. Instead of the grateful solemnity I expected, he leaned back in his chair with visible relief, like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. Aunt Linda actually smiled, a tight, satisfied expression that made my stomach turn. After Mr. Parker finished reading and answering a few questions about property transfers and tax implications, we filed out of his office into the bright afternoon sunshine. That's when Uncle Richard suggested we all go to his house for dinner, to celebrate Mom's life and discuss the next steps. The way he said it made it sound reasonable, even thoughtful. Looking back, I should have seen the trap being set. Richard and Linda's house sat in Riverside's newest subdivision, a McMansion with white columns and a three-car garage that screamed success to anyone driving by. The dining room table was already set for 6, complete with the good china and cloth napkins, like Linda had planned this celebration meal before we'd even heard the will. She bustled around serving pot roast and mashed potatoes, while Richard opened a bottle of wine, playing the gracious host to perfection. For the first hour, the conversation stayed respectably focused on memories of Grandma and plans for organizing her belongings. But as the wine flowed and the dishes were cleared, the tone shifted. Brad started talking about how much the house might actually be worth in the current market, mentioning that similar properties in town had sold for close to $400,000. Jessica chimed in with suggestions about updating the kitchen and bathrooms before listing it, casually mentioning contractors she'd researched. Then Uncle Richard raised his glass and said the words that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. I think we should toast Mom's wisdom in keeping things simple. No complicated trusts, no difficult family dynamics to navigate. She knew exactly what she wanted. He paused, looking directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. And she made sure Sarah understands her place in this family. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Dad shifted uncomfortably beside me, but he didn't speak up. Aunt Linda refilled everyone's wine glasses with mechanical precision. Jessica and Brad exchanged a look that told me they'd discussed this moment beforehand. What exactly does that mean? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Richard leaned forward, adopting the patient tone he'd used to explain things to me when I was a child. Sarah, sweetheart, you're 22 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you to build your own legacy. Mom understood that family wealth should stay with the people who've contributed to building it, who understand the responsibility that comes with it. He gestured around his expensive dining room. She knew you'd be fine on your own. The implication hung in the air like smoke. I hadn't contributed. I didn't understand responsibility. I was young and undeserving while they were mature and worthy. Never mind that I'd spent the last 6 months of Grandma's life driving her to doctor appointments, organizing her medications, and sitting with her through the long nights when the pain kept her awake. Never mind that I'd deferred my final semester of college to be her caregiver when everyone else was too busy with their own lives. Linda topped off her wine glass and raised it with mock solemnity. To Dorothy's practical wisdom and to new beginnings for all of us. The others joined the toast, and I watched my family drink to my exclusion like it was cause for celebration. Dad finally spoke up, suggesting maybe we should discuss how to handle Grandma's personal items, but Richard waved him off with practiced authority. Tom, we'll deal with all that later. Tonight is about appreciating what Mom did for this family. He turned back to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah, I hope you understand this isn't personal, it's just practical. You've got your college education to finish, and someday you'll have your own family to think about. This inheritance represents security for people who need it now. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but really I needed a moment to process what had just happened. Standing in Linda's powder room with its designer wallpaper and gold-framed mirror, I stared at my reflection and tried to understand.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
How I'd become the outsider in my own family. These people had just raised champagne glasses to celebrate the fact that the woman who'd loved me most in the world had apparently written me off completely. When I returned to the dining room, the conversation had moved on to practical matters. Richard was already talking about getting the house appraised and cleaned out, mentioning that he knew someone who specialized in estate sales. The antique shop would need a full inventory, and they'd have to decide which pieces were worth keeping versus selling. They discussed these plans like I wasn't sitting right there, like I had no connection to any of it. The drive home with Dad was uncomfortably quiet. He kept the radio on a classical station and drummed his fingers on the steering wheel at red lights. Finally, as we pulled into our driveway, he turned to me with an expression that was equal parts apologetic and helpless. "Sarah, you know your grandmother loved you very much," he said quietly. "Sometimes these legal matters don't reflect what's in someone's heart." I nodded because there wasn't much else to say. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not wrong like unfair or disappointing, but wrong like a puzzle piece that doesn't fit no matter which way you turn it. Grandma Dot had been many things, but careless with her words wasn't one of them. When she'd squeezed my hand in that hospital bed and promised I'd be fine, she'd meant something specific. The next morning brought a phone call that would change everything, though I didn't know it at the time. Mr. Parker's secretary asked if I could come to his office that afternoon for a brief meeting. She wouldn't elaborate over the phone, just said that Mr. Parker had found some additional documents that pertained to me specifically. I almost didn't go, figuring it was probably just some small remembrance Grandma had left me, maybe her wedding ring or the family Bible. But something in the secretary's tone made me curious enough to drive downtown after my shift at the campus bookstore. Parker and Associates occupied the second floor of a brick building that had housed various professional offices for decades. The waiting room hadn't changed since I was a child, still decorated with the same burgundy carpet and landscape paintings that seemed designed to suggest stability and tradition. Mr. Parker greeted me himself instead of sending his secretary, which struck me as unusual. He looked different than he had during the will reading, more animated somehow, like he was holding back excitement. He led me into his private office and gestured for me to take the same chair I'd occupied 3 days earlier, but this time we were alone. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," he began, settling behind his desk with a thick manila folder. "Your grandmother left very specific instructions about the timing of certain revelations, and I followed those instructions to the letter. But I suspect the last few days have been difficult for you." I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady. The champagne toast was still echoing in my mind. Mr. Parker opened the folder and withdrew a sealed envelope with my name written across it in Grandma's careful script. "Dorothy asked me to give you this privately, after the family will reading was complete. She was very specific about the timing." He slid the envelope across the desk toward me. "She also asked me to have certain documents ready to review with you once you'd read her letter." My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of lavender stationery that Grandma had used for special occasions. Her handwriting was shakier than usual, probably written during her final weeks, but every word was clear. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you've just endured what I suspect was a very unpleasant family gathering. I'm sorry for that, but it was necessary. Your Uncle Richard has always believed that his position as the eldest son entitles him to make decisions for this family, and I needed to see how he would handle what he thought was complete control over my legacy. I suspect I can guess how that went." I glanced up at Mr. Parker, who was watching me with kind eyes and a slight smile. He gestured for me to continue reading. "What Richard and the others don't know is that the will they heard represents only a small portion of what I've built over the years. The house on Maple Street and the antique shop are indeed theirs to divide, but that was never the real inheritance I planned for you. Over the past 15 years, I've been quietly purchasing properties around Riverside, always in my maiden name of Dorothy Sullivan. I also established the Dorothy Sullivan Community Foundation, which owns significant assets that I've been managing privately." My heart started beating faster as I read the next paragraph. "The foundation owns 12 rental properties throughout Riverside, including the building that houses Murphy's Diner and 3 other downtown businesses. It also owns the vacant lot next to Riverside Park, which the city has been trying to purchase for years to expand their community programs. More importantly, it owns the old Whitman estate outside of town, the one with the lake access that developers have been circling like vultures." I had to stop reading for a moment to catch my breath. The Whitman estate was a beautiful property with Victorian-era buildings and pristine lake frontage that everyone assumed would eventually be sold to developers who'd turn it into condominiums. The property had to be worth millions. All of this, Grandma's letter continued, was meant to be yours from the beginning, but I needed to know that you would use it wisely, with the same commitment to community and family that I tried to instill in you during all those afternoons we spent in the garden together. I also needed to see how the rest of the family would treat you when they thought you had nothing. Character reveals itself most clearly when people believe there are no consequences for their actions. The letter went on to explain that Mr. Parker had been the Foundation's legal counsel from the beginning, and that all the documentation was in order. There were specific instructions about how the properties should be managed, suggestions for community projects that could be funded through the Foundation, and a personal note about how proud Grandma was of the young woman I'd become. I know this seems elaborate, perhaps even cruel, the letter concluded, but I've watched this family for 78 years, and I know that Richard would never have accepted your authority if he thought it came too easily. By the time he learns the truth, the Foundation will be legally established with you as its director, and there will be nothing he can do to change that. Use this gift wisely, my dear girl, and remember that real wealth isn't about what you own, but about what you can build for others. When I finished reading, Mr. Parker was already spreading documents across his desk. Property deeds, bank statements, incorporation papers for the Dorothy Sullivan Community Foundation, and a stack of rental agreements that showed a monthly income stream I could barely comprehend. The numbers kept swimming in front of my eyes as I tried to process what I was seeing. The Foundation's assets are currently valued at approximately $8.2 million, Mr. Parker said quietly. That includes the properties, investments, and cash reserves your grandmother accumulated. As the sole director, you'll have complete authority over how those resources are managed and distributed. I stared at the documents, then at the letter, then back at the lawyer who was watching me with obvious satisfaction. She planned all of this. Every detail, he confirmed. Dorothy was one of the sharpest people I've ever known. She started buying properties 20 years ago when prices were low, always using her maiden name to keep the purchases private. She reinvested the rental income, made careful investments, and built something remarkable while everyone thought she was just a sweet old lady who grew roses. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Uncle Richard was celebrating his inheritance of a $300,000 house and a modest antique business, I was sitting in a lawyer's office learning that I'd just become one of the wealthiest people in Riverside. The woman who'd supposedly forgotten me in her will had actually left me an empire. Mr. Parker spent the next hour walking me through the Foundation's structure and my responsibilities as its director. There were ongoing community projects that Grandma had been quietly funding, including scholarships for local students and support for elderly residents who couldn't afford home maintenance. The Foundation also provided low-interest loans for small businesses and had been working with the city on plans for a new community center. As I signed the paperwork that officially transferred control of the Foundation to me, I thought about the champagne toast from the night before. My family had celebrated what they thought was my exclusion, never suspecting that Grandma had been planning the ultimate reversal. She'd given them exactly what they expected while ensuring that the real legacy went to the person she trusted most. The drive home felt surreal, like I was floating through a dream where ordinary Tuesday afternoons could transform your. I kept the Foundation documents in a manila envelope on the passenger seat, checking to make sure they were still there every time I stopped at a traffic light. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I'd started to understand the magnitude of what Grandma had done. She hadn't just left me money or property, she'd left me power, responsibility, and the tools to shape Riverside's future. More importantly, she'd taught me something about the difference between what people think they deserve and what they're actually capable of earning. Uncle Richard could have his Victorian house and his antique shop. I had something far more valuable, the trust of a woman who'd spent 78 years learning how to read people's hearts. That evening, Dad noticed my distracted mood during dinner but didn't press when I said I'd had a busy day at work. I wasn't ready to tell him about the Foundation yet, partly because I was still processing it myself, and partly because I wanted to understand Grandma's strategy completely before revealing the truth. She'd orchestrated this revelation with careful precision, and I suspected she had specific reasons for the timing of everything. After Dad went to bed, I spread the foundation documents across the kitchen table and really studied them for the first time. The scope of what Grandma had built was staggering. 12 rental properties generating steady income, strategic investments in local businesses, and the Whitman estate that was probably worth more than everything else combined. But what struck me most was the careful attention to community impact in every decision she'd made. The rental properties weren't just income generators, they were affordable housing options in a town where decent rentals were hard to find. The business loans had helped launch 3 local restaurants, a bookstore, and a small manufacturing company that employed dozens of people. Even the Whitman estate had been preserved rather than sold to developers, maintaining green space and lake access that benefited everyone in Riverside. I found myself thinking about the conversation at Uncle Richard's house, about his dismissive comments regarding my contributions to the family and my understanding of responsibility. If he only knew that I was now responsible for managing assets worth more than his house, his business, and his entire net worth combined. The thought should have felt satisfying, but instead, it just made me sad. Grandma had been right about revealing character when people thought there were no consequences. The next few days passed normally on the surface, but I felt like I was carrying a secret that made every interaction slightly surreal. At work, I processed textbook orders and helped students find required reading while mentally calculating the foundation's monthly income. At home, I listened to Dad worry about his portion of the inheritance taxes, while knowing I could easily cover those costs without affecting our family's finances. Uncle Richard called twice during that week, both times to discuss logistics for cleaning out Grandma's house. He'd already contacted an estate sale company and wanted to schedule a family meeting to divide up her personal belongings. His tone was brisk and businesslike, the voice of someone who'd moved quickly from grief to practical planning. He mentioned in passing that he hoped I understood why Grandma had structured things the way she had, using the same patronizing tone from the dinner party. I agreed to the family meeting partly out of curiosity and partly because I suspected Grandma had timed things so that the foundation's existence would become public right around the time Richard felt most secure in his new position as family patriarch. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at Grandma's house, giving everyone a chance to walk through and identify items they wanted to keep. Saturday morning brought the kind of crisp autumn weather that had always made Grandma happy. The maple trees lining her street blazed with red and gold leaves, and her rose garden still showed traces of the final blooms she'd tended before going into the hospital. The house looked smaller somehow, maybe because it felt empty without her presence filling the rooms with warmth and purpose. Uncle Richard arrived with a clipboard and measuring tape, clearly planning to approach this systematically. Aunt Linda brought boxes and packing materials, while Brad and Jessica showed up with their phones ready to photograph anything they thought might be valuable. Dad came quietly, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, which accurately reflected how I felt about the whole gathering. The morning proceeded with uncomfortable efficiency as we sorted through 78 years of accumulated possessions. Richard assigned rooms to different family members, suggesting we work independently to avoid conflicts over specific items. I ended up in Grandma's bedroom, going through jewelry boxes and dresser drawers while listening to muffled conversations from other parts of the house. Most of her jewelry was costume pieces with more sentimental than monetary value, but I found her engagement ring and wedding band wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of her jewelry box. There was also a small wooden box containing letters Dad had written to her over the years, including notes I'd sent from college that she'd apparently kept. The personal nature of these items made me realize that Richard's systematic approach was missing the point entirely. Around noon, Linda called everyone to the kitchen for sandwiches she'd brought from home. The conversation was stilted, focused on practical questions about appraisals and estate sale logistics. Richard had made lists of items he thought were worth keeping versus selling, categorizing Grandma's possessions like inventory in a store.
He mentioned that the estate sale company thought they could clear everything within 2 weeks, leaving the house ready for the real estate market. That's when Jessica made an offhand comment that revealed how quickly news traveled in a small town. I heard from Amy Morrison that some lawyers been asking questions about properties around town, she said between bites of her sandwich. Something about tracking down ownership records for a foundation or something, probably some tax thing. My heart started beating faster, but I kept my expression neutral. Richard looked up from his clipboard with mild interest. What kind of foundation? I don't know. Amy didn't have details. Just that Mr. Parker was asking the county clerk about property transfers over the past 20 years. Amy's mom works in the clerk's office, so she hears about stuff like that. Jessica shrugged like it was barely worth mentioning, but Richard was suddenly very interested. His face had taken on the sharp, focused expression I remembered from my childhood, when he thought someone was trying to put something over on him. Parker's mom's lawyer, he said slowly. Why would he be researching property transfers now? The will was straightforward. I felt the moment approaching like a storm on the horizon, the careful timing that Grandma had orchestrated finally reaching its crescendo. Mr. Parker had told me that the foundation's existence would become public record once certain filings were complete, and apparently that process was now underway. Richard might think he'd inherited control of the family legacy, but he was about to learn how wrong he was. Linda suggested that Richard call Mr. Parker directly to ask about the property research, but Dad pointed out that it probably wasn't any of their business unless it directly affected the estate. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I noticed Richard checking his phone several times during the afternoon, probably trying to decide whether to pursue the foundation question. We finished going through the house by late afternoon, with everyone claiming various items and agreeing to let Richard coordinate the estate sale for everything else. As we prepared to leave, he pulled me aside for what I assumed would be another patronizing speech about understanding my place in the family hierarchy. Sarah, I want you to know that despite how things worked out with the inheritance, you'll always be part of this family, he said with practiced sincerity. If you ever need anything, advice about career decisions or help with major purchases, don't hesitate to ask.
Building something remarkable, and now it's in exactly the right hands. As I left his office, I realized that the real test was just beginning. Grandma had given me the tools to make a difference in Riverside, but she'd also given me a family situation that would require careful navigation. Richard's reaction to learning about the foundation would reveal whether he was capable of growth or whether his character was as fixed as Grandma had suspected. I didn't have to wait long to find out. My phone rang at 7:30 that evening while I was grading papers for the tutoring job I'd picked up to help with expenses. The caller ID showed Uncle Richard's number, and his voice when I answered was tight with barely controlled anger. Sarah, we need to talk. Now, parts 2. 5. The stakes revelation through the mentor's influence. The silence on the phone stretched long enough that I could hear Richard's breathing, sharp and controlled like he was trying to contain something explosive. When he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped to the tone he'd used when I was 8 years old and had accidentally broken one of Linda's decorative plates. I just got off the phone with James Parker. He said, each word deliberate and measured. It seems there are some things about Mom's estate that weren't mentioned during the will reading. Things that directly concern this family's financial future. I settled back in my desk chair, surrounded by the stack of algebra worksheets I'd been grading for Mrs. Henderson's tutoring service. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was helping high school students solve equations for $15 an hour while controlling assets worth more than most people would see in several lifetimes. What kind of things? Richard's laugh held no humor whatsoever. Don't play games with me, Sarah. The Dorothy Sullivan Community Foundation. Ring any bells? His voice was gaining volume now, the careful control starting to crack. $8.2 million in assets, 12 rental properties, the Whitman estate, all managed by my 22-year-old niece who everyone thought got nothing. The way he said 22-year-old niece made it sound like an accusation, as if my age was evidence of some fundamental unfitness for responsibility. I could picture him pacing around his study, probably wearing the same expression he'd had when I was 16 and he'd caught me driving Dad's car without permission. Back then, his disapproval had the power to make me feel small and guilty. Now it just made me tired. Grandma Dorothy left very specific instructions about when I should learn about the foundation, I said calmly. Mr. Parker was following her wishes to the letter. Her wishes. Richard's voice turned bitter. You mean her plan to manipulate this family from beyond the grave? Do you have any idea what kind of position this puts me in? I've already started making arrangements based on the assumption that Mom's estate was limited to what we heard in that will reading. I've talked to real estate agents, made commitments to Linda about how we'd use our portion of the inheritance. There was something almost pathetic in his tone, the sound of a man who'd been planning his victory celebration only to discover that the game had entirely different rules. I found myself thinking about the champagne toast, about Jessica and Brad raising their glasses to celebrate my exclusion while I sat there feeling like the family's forgotten afterthought. Now I understood that Grandma had been watching that exact scenario play out in her mind when she'd planned this whole elaborate revelation. Uncle Richard, the foundation doesn't change anything about what you inherited from the will, I pointed out. You still get your share of the house and the antique shop. This is completely separate. Separate, he repeated the word like it tasted bad. Sarah, do you understand what $8 million means in a town like Riverside? Do you have any concept of the responsibility that comes with that kind of influence? This isn't some college trust fund where you can make mistakes and learn from them. This affects the entire community. The condescension in his voice was so thick I could practically see it dripping through the phone. This was Uncle Richard at his worst, the version of himself that emerged whenever he felt his authority was being questioned. I'd watched him use this tone with restaurant servers who got his order wrong, with store clerks who couldn't find items fast enough, with anyone he perceived as beneath his station in life. I think Grandma Dorothy understood the responsibility perfectly well, I said, letting a slight edge creep into my voice. She spent 15 years building something remarkable for this community. I'm just the person she trusted to continue her work. Trusted. Richard's laugh was sharp and humorless. Sarah, Mom was 78 years old and dying of cancer. People in that condition don't always make the most rational decisions. Parker should have advised her against concentrating so much power in someone so young and inexperienced. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, the suggestion that Grandma Dorothy's final wishes were the product of diminished capacity rather than careful planning. It was exactly the kind of argument I'd expected from Richard, the automatic assumption that anyone who didn't choose him must have been thinking incorrectly. What he didn't understand was that Grandma had been preparing for this conversation for years, anticipating every possible objection he might raise. Mr. Parker has copies of all the foundation documents going back to its establishment, I said quietly. Everything was reviewed by multiple attorneys and structured according to Grandma's very specific instructions. She was completely lucid and determined about how she wanted her legacy handled. Her legacy. Richard's voice dropped to barely controlled fury. Mom's legacy was supposed to be this family working together, supporting each other through difficult times. Instead, she's created a situation where a college student has more financial power than the rest of us combined. How is that supposed to bring us together? I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair, thinking about the letter Grandma had written, about her words regarding character, revealing itself when people thought there were no consequences. Richard's reaction was proving her point more effectively than any argument I could have made. He wasn't upset about family unity or Grandma's mental state. He was angry because the power structure hadn't unfolded according to his expectations. Maybe the foundation isn't supposed to bring us together, I said finally. Maybe it's supposed to show us who we really are when we think nobody's watching. The silence that followed was so complete I wondered if the call had dropped. When Richard spoke again, his voice was controlled but cold, the tone he used when he'd made a decision and didn't want to hear any further discussion. Sarah, I'm going to say this once, and I hope you'll listen carefully.
This family has been built on respect for experience and wisdom. Mom may have gotten confused about some things toward the end, but that doesn't mean the rest of us have to accept decisions that don't make sense for everyone involved. He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. I think it would be in everyone's best interest if you worked with Parker to transfer the foundation's management to someone with more appropriate qualifications. There it was, the demand I'd been expecting since the moment I'd learned about Richard's phone call to Mr. Parker. He wasn't asking for collaboration or suggesting we work together. He was telling me to hand over control of something that had never belonged to him in the first place, using the same authoritative tone he'd used to order me around when I was a child. That's not going to happen, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. The foundation belongs to the community, and Grandma chose me to manage it because she trusted my judgment. That's not going to change because you're uncomfortable with her decision. We'll see about that. Richard's voice had turned flat and businesslike, the tone he used when making threats he intended to follow through on. I've already scheduled a meeting with Parker for tomorrow morning. Linda's cousin works for a law firm in Columbus that specializes in estate disputes. We'll be exploring all of our options. The threat was clear enough, even wrapped in legal language. Richard was going to challenge the foundation's structure, probably claiming that Grandma lacked the mental capacity to make such significant decisions during her final months. It was exactly the kind of move I should have expected from someone who'd spent his entire life believing that the world owed him deference to his opinions. You're welcome to explore whatever options you think are appropriate, I said calmly. But I'd suggest you read through all of the foundation documents before you commit to any expensive legal strategies. Grandma Dorothy was very thorough in her planning. I ended the call before he could respond, setting the phone down with hands that were steadier than I'd expected. The confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Mr. Parker had handed me that manila envelope, but experiencing it firsthand was different from anticipating it. Richard's reaction revealed everything Grandma had suspected about his character, his automatic assumption that power belonged to him by right of age and gender. The next morning brought a cold rain that matched my mood as I drove to the campus bookstore for my Tuesday shift. The familiar routine of processing orders and helping students find textbooks felt surreal after the previous evening's conversation with Richard. I kept thinking about his threat to challenge the foundation legally, wondering if Grandma had truly anticipated every possible attack on her plans. Around lunchtime, my phone buzzed with a text from Dad asking if I wanted to meet for coffee after his shift at the hardware store. The message was casual, but something about the timing made me suspect that Richard had already started working the family network, probably looking for allies in whatever legal challenge he was planning. Dad had always been the peacemaker in family disputes, the person who tried to find middle ground even when the positions were fundamentally incompatible. I found him waiting at Murphy's Diner, sitting in a corner booth with 2 cups of coffee already ordered. The diner was one of the properties the foundation owned, though Dad didn't know that yet. Mrs. Murphy had been paying rent to the Dorothy Sullivan Foundation for 3 years, probably never connecting the name to Grandma Dorothy Mitchell. The monthly income from this single property was more than Dad made in 6 months at his job. "You look tired," Dad said as I slid into the booth across from him. His own face showed the strain of recent weeks, the accumulated stress of losing his mother and dealing with the complicated emotions that came with unexpected inheritance. "Everything going okay with school and work?" I stirred sugar into my coffee and studied his expression, trying to read how much he already knew about the foundation situation. Dad had never been good at hiding his feelings, and right now he looked like someone carrying information he wasn't sure how to share. "School's fine, work's fine. How are you handling everything with Grandma's house and the estate stuff?" Dad sighed and rubbed his temples with the kind of weary gesture that suggested he'd been having difficult conversations. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. Richard called me this morning. He's pretty upset about some legal complications that have come up regarding your grandmother's estate." The phrasing was careful, diplomatic, typical of Dad's approach to family conflicts. He was trying to gather information without taking sides, probably hoping he could help mediate whatever dispute was developing between Richard and me. What he didn't understand was that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved through better communication. He found out about the Dorothy Sullivan Community Foundation, I said simply. Grandma established it years ago using her maiden name. She left me in charge of managing it. Dad's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. Foundation? What kind of foundation? I spent the next 20 minutes explaining what I'd learned from Mr. Parker, watching Dad's expression shift from confusion to amazement to something approaching concern. He asked careful questions about the foundation's assets and structure, trying to understand how his mother had managed to build something so substantial without anyone in the family knowing about it. $8 million, he repeated quietly, setting down his coffee cup with shaking hands. Mom had $8 million and never said anything to any of us. She was protecting it, I explained. Building something for the community, while making sure it wouldn't get caught up in family politics or disputes over inheritance. Dad leaned back in the booth, staring out the rain-streaked window at the downtown street where he'd grown up. No wonder Richard's upset. He's been making plans based on thinking Mom's entire estate was what we heard in the will reading. Finding out there's this whole other dimension he didn't know about. He trailed off, shaking his head. Dad, did Grandma ever talk to you about her concerns regarding how the family would handle a large inheritance? He was quiet for a long moment, obviously thinking back through years of conversations with his mother. She used to worry about Richard sometimes, he said finally. Worried that success had made him think he was entitled to make decisions for everyone else. She loved him, but she didn't always trust his judgment when it came to putting family needs ahead of his own interests. The admission was difficult for Dad, who'd spent decades trying to maintain peace between his older brother and the rest of the family. Richard's personality had always been dominating, his success with the hardware store and his expensive house giving him a sense of authority that extended beyond his actual responsibilities. Grandma had watched this dynamic play out for years, apparently deciding that her legacy needed protection from exactly the kind of reaction Richard was having now. Richard thinks I should transfer control of the foundation to someone with more experience, I said carefully. He's talking about legal challenges, claiming Grandma wasn't thinking clearly when she made these arrangements. Dad's face darkened with the first real anger I'd seen from him since Grandma's funeral. Your grandmother was sharp as a tack right up until the end. Anyone who spent 5 minutes with her during her final weeks could see that. Richard's just angry because things didn't work out the way he expected. The loyalty in his voice surprised me. Dad had always been caught between his mother's strong opinions and his brother's dominating personality, usually trying to find compromises that kept everyone reasonably satisfied. But the suggestion that Grandma had been mentally incompetent seemed to have crossed a line for him. What do you think I should do? I asked. Dad reached across the table and squeezed my hand, his expression serious but supportive. I think you should do exactly what your grandmother trusted you to do. She didn't make this decision lightly, Sarah. She spent years watching this family, understanding who could be trusted with something important. He paused, looking directly into my eyes. She chose you for a reason. The conversation with Dad stayed with me through the rest of the week as I waited for Richard's next move. I'd expected immediate legal action, but instead there was silence, the kind of ominous quiet that suggested something was being planned behind the scenes. I went to classes, worked my shifts at the bookstore and tutoring service, and tried to maintain normal routines while feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. Friday afternoon brought a call from Mr. Parker asking if I could come to his office Monday morning for a meeting. He wouldn't elaborate over the phone, but his tone suggested that Richard had indeed followed through on his threat to explore legal options. I spent the weekend reading through every document in the foundation files, trying to understand exactly how thoroughly Grandma had protected her plans from potential challenges. What I found was a masterclass in legal preparation. Every decision had been documented with medical evaluations confirming Grandma's mental competency at the time. Multiple attorneys had reviewed the foundation structure. There were letters from community leaders supporting the projects the foundation had funded, creating a paper trail that demonstrated both the wisdom of Grandma's investments and the positive impact of her work. Most importantly, there was a sealed envelope marked to be opened only in case of legal challenge to foundation structure. Inside was a letter addressed to whichever judge might be asked to review the foundation's validity, written in Grandma's careful handwriting and notarized by 3 different witnesses. The letter was devastating in its quiet precision. Grandma had anticipated exactly the kind of challenge Richard was mounting, and she'd prepared for it with clinical thoroughness. She documented specific conversations with family members, including direct quotes from Richard about his plans to sell the family properties and invest the proceeds for his own benefit. She outlined her concerns about his treatment of other family members and his tendency to prioritize his own interests over community welfare. But what made the letter truly powerful was its tone. There was no anger or vindictiveness, just the measured observations of someone who'd spent decades watching human nature reveal itself in small telling moments. Grandma had loved Richard as her son, but she'd also seen him clearly enough to understand that he couldn't be trusted with the kind of power the foundation represented. Monday morning's meeting at Parker and Associates included more people than I'd expected. Mr. Parker introduced me to Helen Rodriguez, an attorney who specialized in estate law, and David Chen, a financial advisor who'd been helping manage the foundation's investments for the past 5 years. Both had been working with Grandma for years apparently, though she'd kept their involvement completely separate from any family interactions. Your uncle retained counsel over the weekend, Mr. Parker explained as we settled around the conference table. Linda's cousin represents a firm that's known for aggressive challenges to estate planning decisions. They've requested copies of all foundation documents and medical records related to your grandmother's mental state during her final months. Helen Rodriguez leaned forward with the kind of confident expression that suggested she'd handled this type of challenge many times before. We've dealt with the Morrison firm before. They specialize in cases where family members claim elderly relatives lacked capacity to make significant financial decisions. Their success rate is actually quite low when the estate planning was done properly. David Chen opened a laptop and pulled up financial records that showed the foundation's performance over the past 15 years. Your grandmother was remarkably savvy about investments and property management. The foundation's growth wasn't lucky or accidental. It was the result of careful planning and excellent decision-making over an extended period. As the meeting progressed, I began to understand just how thoroughly Grandma had prepared for this exact situation. She'd not only built something remarkable, she'd protected it with legal strategies that would be difficult for Richard to challenge successfully. More than that, she'd created a record of her own competence and decision-making ability that would be hard to dispute in court. There's one more thing, Mr. Parker said toward the end of the meeting. He pulled out the sealed envelope I'd found in the foundation files and set it on the table. Your grandmother left specific instructions about when this should be opened. She said it was only to be used if someone challenged her mental capacity or the foundation's legitimacy. Helen Rodriguez examined the envelope's notarization and witness signatures before carefully opening it. As she read Grandma's letter, her expression shifted from professional interest to something approaching amazement. This is remarkable. She documented specific conversations and behaviors going back years, all related to concerns about how this potential challenge might develop. The letter painted a picture of a woman who'd understood her family's dynamics with painful clarity. Grandma had seen Richard's sense of entitlement developing over decades, his increasing tendency to treat family relationships as opportunities for personal advantage. She'd watched him dismiss other people's opinions and assume authority he hadn't earned, and she'd concluded that he couldn't be trusted with the power that significant wealth represented. But what made the letter truly powerful was its focus on protection rather than punishment. Grandma hadn't excluded Richard from the foundation out of spite or anger. She'd excluded him because she'd understood that his personality would have turned the foundation into a tool for his own advancement rather than community service. Every decision had been made with the welfare of Riverside in mind, not family politics or personal preferences. As I left Mr. Parker's office that afternoon, I felt the weight of Grandma's trust in a way I hadn't fully understood before. She hadn't just left me money or property. She'd left me a responsibility that would shape Riverside's future for generations, and she'd protected that responsibility with the kind of thorough planning that reflected decades of careful observation and preparation. The foundation wasn't just Grandma's legacy. It was her final act of love for a community she'd served faithfully, and a granddaughter she'd believed could continue that service. Richard could challenge the legal structure all he wanted, but he couldn't challenge the fundamental truth that Grandma had seen his character clearly and found it wanting. That evening, I sat in my small apartment going through the foundation's current projects, trying to understand the scope of what I'd inherited. There were scholarship programs for local students, home repair assistance for elderly residents, and small business loans that had helped launch dozens of successful enterprises. The foundation's work touched virtually every aspect of life in Riverside, from education to economic development to social services. Most remarkably, Grandma had managed all of this while maintaining the public appearance of a sweet elderly woman who grew roses and organized church potluck dinners. She'd hidden her business acumen behind a facade of gentle domesticity, probably understanding that her effectiveness depended partly on people underestimating her capabilities. Richard's shock at learning about the foundation reflected his own failure to see past the stereotypes he'd imposed on his mother. The phone rang just as I was closing the last file folder, and I recognized the number as belonging to Murphy's Diner. Mrs. Murphy's voice was warm but concerned when I answered, and she explained that she'd heard rumors around town about legal troubles involving the Dorothy Sullivan Foundation. "I don't know if this matters," she said, "but that foundation has been the best landlord I've ever dealt with. Always fair with rent, quick to handle maintenance issues, never pressured me to make changes I couldn't afford. Whoever's running it understands small business and treats tenants like partners rather than just income sources." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Mrs. Murphy sharing stories about the foundation's quiet support for local businesses and community projects. She'd never known that Dorothy Sullivan was actually Dorothy Mitchell, but she'd experienced firsthand the foundation's commitment to Riverside's welfare. Her call was followed by similar conversations over the next few days as word spread through town about the foundation's connection to our family. What emerged was a picture of Grandma Dorothy that none of us had fully understood. While we'd seen her as a beloved matriarch focused on family and gardening, the broader community had known her as a visionary who'd quietly worked to improve life for everyone in Riverside. She'd funded playground equipment for the elementary school, supported the volunteer fire department, and provided low-interest loans that had kept several local businesses from closing during difficult economic periods. By Thursday evening, I had a stack of letters and messages from community members expressing support for the foundation and concern about rumors that its management might be changing. The outpouring of gratitude was overwhelming, revealing the true scope of Grandma's impact on Riverside in ways that the financial documents couldn't capture. Richard's legal challenge was still pending, but I was beginning to understand that Grandma had prepared for this battle on multiple fronts. She'd protected the foundation legally, financially, and through the relationships she'd built with people whose lives had been improved by her work. Any attempt to discredit her judgment would have to contend with a community that had experienced her wisdom firsthand. The real test, I realized, wouldn't be whether Richard could successfully challenge the foundation's structure. The test would be whether I could prove worthy of the trust Grandma had placed in me, whether I could continue the work she'd started with the same combination of vision, pragmatism, and genuine care for others that had made her efforts so successful. As I fell asleep that night, I thought about the champagne toast that had started this whole journey, about the way my family had celebrated what they thought was my exclusion from Grandma's legacy. None of them had understood that the real legacy wasn't about money or property. It was about responsibility, service, and the quiet satisfaction that came from building something larger than yourself. Grandma Dorothy had spent 15 years preparing me for this moment, teaching me through example how to see past immediate appearances to longer-term consequences. Now it was time to prove that her faith in my character had been justified, that the young woman she'd trusted with her life's work could carry it forward with the same wisdom and dedication she'd demonstrated. Part 6 Mine. The hidden message through the exile period. Friday brought an unseasonably warm day for late October, the kind of Indian summer afternoon that made Grandma Dorothy's garden bloom one last time before winter settled in for good. I was walking across campus between classes when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that simply read, "Check your mailbox. Important delivery. JP." The message had to be from Mr. Parker, though I couldn't imagine what kind of delivery would require such cryptic communication. My apartment building's mailboxes were located in the cramped lobby that smelled perpetually of cleaning solution and old carpet, and I'd grown accustomed to finding nothing more exciting than utility bills and grocery store circulars. Today,
However, there was a small, padded envelope wedged into the narrow space, addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside the envelope was something I never would have expected. A key, not a modern house key or car key, but an old-fashioned brass key with an ornate head that looked like it belonged to a piece of antique furniture. Attached to it, with a small piece of string, was a handwritten note that made my pulse quicken. "Dorothy's desk, bottom drawer. She wanted you to find this when you were ready. Miss JP." The desk in question had to be the massive mahogany writing desk that had dominated Grandma's study for as long as I could remember. It was an imposing piece of furniture with intricate carvings and multiple drawers, the kind of antique that seemed to hold generations of family secrets. During the house sorting last weekend, Richard had claimed the desk for himself, mentioning that it would look perfect in his home office once he had it professionally refinished. The key felt warm in my palm as I walked back toward campus, my mind racing with possibilities about what Grandma might have hidden in a locked drawer. She'd been a woman who kept meticulous records of everything from garden plantings to community volunteer schedules, but there had always been aspects of her life that remained private, even mysterious. The foundation had been one such secret, revealed only after her death, according to carefully planned timing. My afternoon molecular biology lab dragged endlessly as I tried to focus on protein synthesis while thinking about that brass key. Professor Martinez noticed my distraction twice, reminding me to follow proper pipetting technique and to record my observations more carefully. By the time class ended at 4:30, I'd made a decision that probably qualified as either brave or reckless, depending on your perspective. Richard's house sat in the Pine Ridge subdivision, a development of oversized homes that had been built during Riverside's brief economic boom in the early 2000s. The houses all looked vaguely similar, with their brick facades and three-car garages, designed to project prosperity rather than comfort. Richard's lawn was perfectly manicured, his driveway pressure washed to pristine cleanliness, everything about the property screaming success and control. I parked across the street and sat in my car for 10 minutes, watching the house for signs of activity. Richard's truck wasn't in the driveway, and Linda's sedan was also missing, which meant they were probably both still at work. The desk would most likely be in Richard's study, a room I'd visited exactly once during a family gathering where he'd shown off his collection of golf trophies and business awards. The decision to use the spare key hidden under the decorative rock beside the front porch felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Richard and Linda had given me that key years ago when I'd occasionally house-sat for them during weekend trips, but using it now to search for something they didn't know existed was definitely not what they'd had in mind. Still, the brass key in my pocket seemed to pulse with importance, and Grandma's voice echoed in my memory, "Sometimes the right thing and the easy thing are completely different, honey." The house was silent except for the hum of central air conditioning and the distant tick of a grandfather clock in the living room. Richard's study was exactly as I remembered it, with its leather furniture and wall of business books that looked more decorative than functional. Grandma's desk dominated one corner of the room, looking somehow diminished in its new environment, like a wild animal that had been caged. The desk's bottom drawer was indeed locked, its brass handle refusing to budge when I tried to open it. The old key slid into the lock with perfect precision, turning smoothly despite what must have been years of disuse. Inside the drawer was a collection of items that painted a picture of Grandma Dorothy I'd never seen before. There were photograph albums filled with pictures of Riverside from decades past, showing the town's transformation from a struggling industrial community to the thriving small city it had become. Many of the photos showed buildings and properties I now knew the foundation owned, documented at various stages of renovation and improvement. Grandma had apparently been photographing her investments over the years, creating a visual record of her impact on the community's development. Beneath the albums was a leather-bound journal with entries dating back more than 20 years. The handwriting was unmistakably Grandma's, though the content was unlike anything I'd associated with the woman who'd taught me to bake cookies and identify wildflowers. These were the notes of a shrewd businesswoman analyzing real estate opportunities, tracking market trends, and planning long-term investment strategies. One entry from 15 years ago made me sit back in Richard's expensive office chair, purchased the Morrison building today for $85,000. Richard thinks I'm getting too old to handle my own finances, but he has no vision for what this town could become. The building needs work, but the location is perfect for the downtown revitalization that's coming. Sometimes the best investments are the ones that other people can't see the value in. Page after page revealed the methodical thinking behind every property purchase, every business loan, every community project the foundation had supported. Grandma hadn't been making emotional decisions or sentimental investments, she'd been building an empire with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was doing and why. But what struck me most was the recurring theme throughout the journal entry: her growing concern about Richard's attitude toward money and power. Entry after entry documented conversations where he'd dismissed community needs in favor of personal profit, where he'd suggested that family resources should be concentrated among family members rather than wasted on outsiders. A particularly revealing entry from 3 years ago read: Richard stopped by today to suggest I should sell the antique shop and simplify my finances. He's worried that I'm not making the most profitable use of my assets. When I mentioned the scholarship fund I've been considering, he actually laughed and said charity should begin at home. He has no understanding that our home is this community, that we're only as strong as the people around us. The journal painted a picture of a woman who'd spent years watching her eldest son reveal character traits that deeply troubled her. Richard's success in business had apparently convinced him that financial worth was the only measure of value, that people who had less money deserved less consideration. Grandma had seen this attitude developing and had made her plans accordingly. At the bottom of the drawer was an envelope marked for Sarah's eyes only in Grandma's familiar handwriting. Inside was another letter, this one longer and more personal than the one Mr. Parker had given me. As I read, I felt like I was having a conversation with Grandma across the boundaries of death, her voice clear and warm in every carefully chosen word. My dearest Sarah, the letter began. If you're reading this, then you've found the key I left with James and you've had the courage to come looking for answers. I'm proud of you for that courage, though I suspect it means you're also dealing with exactly the kind of family conflict I hoped to avoid but knew was inevitable. The letter went on to explain that the journal and photographs were meant to help me understand the full scope of what the foundation represented. Grandma had documented everything not out of vanity or pride, but because she'd wanted me to see the careful thought behind every decision. She'd known that Richard would challenge my authority, probably claiming that an elderly woman couldn't possibly have built something so complex without assistance or manipulation. The truth is, Grandma wrote, I've been preparing for this transition for years, watching and waiting for the right moment to begin teaching you what you'd need to know. Every conversation we had about money and responsibility, every time I took you with me to visit community projects, every afternoon we spent in the garden talking about how things grow and change, all of that was preparation for this moment. I remembered those garden conversations differently than I had that morning. What I'd thought were casual chats about flower varieties and soil conditions had actually been lessons in patience, planning, and the kind of long-term thinking that successful investing required. When Grandma had explained how she chose which plants to cultivate and which to remove, she'd been teaching me about resource allocation and strategic decision making. The letter continued with specific instructions about managing the foundation's current projects and relationships. There were detailed notes about each of the rental property tenants, including personal information about their families and businesses that would help me understand their needs and challenges. Grandma had known these people not just as sources of income, but as community members whose success contributed to Riverside's overall prosperity. She'd also included guidance about Richard's likely responses to learning about the foundation. "Your uncle is a good man in many ways," she wrote, "but success has made him believe that his opinions are more valuable than other people's needs. He'll try to convince you that you're too young and inexperienced to handle this responsibility, but don't let his fear become your doubt. I chose you not despite your youth, but because of it. Young people still believe that change is possible." The final paragraph of the letter contained instructions that made my hands tremble as I read them. In the back of this journal, you'll find account numbers and contact information for 3 attorneys who specialize in foundation law. I've already paid their retainer fees, and they're expecting your call when Richard begins his legal challenge. Because he will challenge this, Sarah, it's in his nature to assume that power belongs to him, and he won't accept that I made a different choice. I found the attorney information exactly where Grandma had indicated, along with detailed notes about the legal strategies she'd anticipated Richard might use and the countermeasures she'd prepared. The level of planning was staggering, revealing a woman who'd thought through every possible scenario and prepared for contingencies I never would have considered. The sound of a car door slamming in the driveway sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I quickly returned everything to the drawer, locked it, and slipped the key into my pocket just as I heard the front door opening. Heavy footsteps in the hallway suggested Richard had come home early, probably to work in his study before dinner. I was examining his golf trophy collection with what I hoped looked like casual interest when he appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to suspicion in the space of a heartbeat. "Sarah, I wasn't expecting you." His tone was carefully neutral, but his eyes were scanning the room, like he was looking for evidence of something out of place. "How did you get in? You gave me a key years ago, remember, for when I used to house sit." I kept my voice light and friendly, though my heart was beating fast enough that I worried he might hear it. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to see how Grandma's desk looked in your study. It fits perfectly in here." Richard's gaze lingered on the desk for a moment longer than felt comfortable, but he seemed to accept my explanation. "It does look good, doesn't it? Linda thinks we should have it appraised before we decide whether to keep it or include it in the estate sale." The casual mention of selling Grandma's desk made my stomach clench, but I managed to nod agreeably. "That makes sense. It's definitely a valuable piece. Sarah, since you're here, maybe we should talk about this foundation situation." Richard closed the study door behind him and settled into his desk chair, adopting the posture he probably used during business negotiations. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, and I want you to know that I understand why you might feel defensive about Mom's decisions." The shift to a more conciliatory tone caught me off guard, though I suspected it was strategic rather than genuine. Richard was a skilled salesman who understood the value of adjusting his approach when direct confrontation wasn't working. "I'm not feeling defensive," I said carefully. "I'm just trying to honor Grandma's wishes and continue the work she started." Of course, Richard leaned forward with the kind of earnest expression that probably worked well with his hardware store customers. "But you have to understand the position this puts the family in. We're talking about millions of dollars in community assets, and there are legal and financial responsibilities that come with that level of wealth." He spent the next 20 minutes outlining his concerns about my qualifications and experience, using the kind of patient, educational tone that managed to be both condescending and superficially supportive.
According to Richard, my youth and inexperience made me vulnerable to manipulation by unscrupulous advisors who might take advantage of my good intentions. The foundation's assets were too important to risk on someone who didn't fully understand the complexities of estate management and community development. What I'm proposing, he said finally, is a collaborative approach. You could remain involved in the foundation's activities, maybe as a board member or advisor, while someone with more appropriate experience handles the day-to-day management and financial decisions. The suggestion was wrapped in language about family cooperation and shared responsibility, but the underlying message was clear. Richard wanted control of the foundation, while allowing me to maintain a ceremonial role that would make the transition appear voluntary rather than hostile. It was exactly the kind of compromise that would let him claim he was looking out for my best interests while ensuring that the real power remained where he thought it belonged. That's an interesting idea, I said, buying time while I thought about how Grandma would have handled this conversation. But I think I need to understand my current responsibilities better before I make any decisions about changing the foundation's structure. Richard's smile became slightly strained. Sarah, I hope you're not going to let pride get in the way of practical decision-making. This isn't about whether you're capable or worthy, it's about making sure Mom's legacy is protected by people who have experience managing this level of responsibility. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Richard becoming increasingly frustrated by my refusal to commit to his proposal. He clearly expected me to be grateful for his offer to remain involved in a reduced capacity, and my resistance was forcing him to reveal more of his true feelings about the situation. Finally, he leaned back in his chair with the kind of sigh that suggested his patience was being tested. Look, Sarah, I didn't want to have to bring this up, but there are already people in town asking questions about this foundation situation. People are curious about how a 22-year-old college student ended up controlling so much community wealth. The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. Richard was suggesting that my legitimacy as the foundation's director was already being questioned by others, that my position was more precarious than I might realize. It was the kind of psychological pressure he'd probably used in business negotiations, creating doubt and urgency to push people toward decisions that favored his interests. What kind of questions? I asked, though I suspected the people asking questions were primarily Richard himself and whoever he'd chosen to confide in. Concerns about whether Mom was thinking clearly during her final months, whether she really understood the implications of concentrating so much power in someone so young. Richard's voice carried a note of regret, as if he hated to be the messenger of such troubling information. I've been defending your right to inherit whatever Mom left you, but there are limits to how long I can hold off legitimate concerns about the community's welfare. I stood up from the leather chair where I'd been sitting, suddenly feeling like the walls of Richard's study were closing in around me. The brass key in my pocket felt heavy with the weight of everything I'd learned from Grandma's hidden journal, all the evidence of careful planning and shrewd decision-making that Richard was now trying to dismiss as the confused actions of an elderly woman. I appreciate your concern, I said, keeping my voice level, despite the anger building in my chest. But I think Grandma knew exactly what she was doing when she made her plans. The foundation has been operating successfully for years, and I don't see any reason to change that now. Richard's expression hardened slightly, the mask of concerned family member slipping just enough to reveal the frustration underneath. Sarah, I hope you'll think carefully about what's really best for everyone involved. Family relationships are more important than any amount of money, and I'd hate to see the situation damage bonds that have taken years to build. The threat was clearer now, wrapped in language about family unity, but carrying the obvious implication that continued resistance on my part would result in exactly the kind of family conflict Richard claimed to want to avoid. He was offering me one last chance to capitulate gracefully before he moved to more aggressive tactics. I'll definitely think about everything you've said, I replied, which was true even if my thinking would likely lead to conclusions Richard wouldn't appreciate. Thank you for taking the time to explain your perspective. I left Richard's house with my mind churning over everything I'd learned from Grandma's journal and the conversation that followed. The brass key in my pocket felt like a talisman, a connection to the woman who'd spent years preparing me for exactly this kind of confrontation. Richard's offer of a ceremonial role in exchange for real control was probably the best deal he'd offer voluntarily, which meant the legal challenge Grandma had anticipated was now inevitable. The drive back to my apartment took me through downtown Riverside, past several of the buildings the foundation owned, and the small businesses it had helped establish. At Murphy's Diner, I could see the dinner crowd gathering around tables that had been serving the community for decades, thanks to the foundation's support. The evening light made the whole scene look golden and peaceful, like a Norman Rockwell painting of small-town American life. But underneath that peaceful surface was a battle for the soul of what Grandma Dorothy had built, a conflict between Richard's vision of wealth as a tool for personal advancement and her belief that prosperity meant lifting up the entire community. The journal I'd found made it clear that this wasn't a simple disagreement about financial management, it was a fundamental clash of values that had been building for years. Back in my small apartment, I spread the attorney contact information across my kitchen table and tried to decide which firm to call first. Grandma had left detailed notes about each attorney's strengths and specialties, along with her assessment of which legal strategies were most likely to succeed if Richard challenged the foundation's structure. The first attorney on her list was Margaret Chen, a specialist in estate law who had a reputation for aggressive defense of clients' final wishes. According to Grandma's notes, Chen had successfully defended similar foundations against family challenges, often by demonstrating that the deceased had shown consistent competence and clear intentions over extended periods. The second attorney was David Rodriguez, whose expertise focused on nonprofit law and community development. Grandma had noted that Rodriguez understood the broader implications of foundation work and could articulate the community benefits that justified unusual estate planning decisions. The third contact was somewhat different, Elizabeth Warren, not the senator, but a forensic accountant, who specialized in documenting the financial competence of elderly clients. Grandma had apparently worked with Warren for several years, creating a detailed record of her investment decisions and their outcomes that would be difficult for anyone to dismiss as the actions of a confused or manipulated person. As I read through Grandma's notes about each professional, I began to understand the scope of the preparation she'd undertaken. This wasn't just legal protection, it was a comprehensive strategy designed to demonstrate her competence, document her intentions, and prove that the foundation's structure reflected careful consideration rather than impulsive decision-making. The phone rang just as I was reaching for Margaret Chen's business card, and I recognized the number as belonging to Mrs. Henderson from the tutoring service. Her voice was warm but concerned when I answered, and she explained that she'd heard rumors around town about legal troubles involving my family and the Dorothy Sullivan Foundation. "I don't know if this helps," she said, "but I wanted you to know that foundation has been quietly supporting our after-school tutoring program for 3 years. They never asked for recognition or publicity, just sent a check every month that allowed us to help kids whose families couldn't afford private tutoring." The conversation continued for 15 minutes, with Mrs. Henderson sharing details about how the foundation's support had impacted local education initiatives. She'd never known that Dorothy Sullivan was actually Dorothy Mitchell, but she'd worked closely enough with the foundation to understand its commitment to community welfare and educational opportunity. Her call was followed by 2 more that evening, both from community members who'd heard about potential changes to the foundation's management and wanted to express their support for its current work. Word was apparently spreading through Riverside's tight-knit network of civic organizations and local businesses, creating exactly the kind of community attention that Richard had warned me about. But the attention wasn't negative, as Richard had implied. Instead, it was overwhelmingly supportive, reflecting the genuine gratitude of people whose lives had been improved by Grandma's quiet philanthropy. These calls made me realize that the foundation's work had created a constituency that would resist any attempts to change its mission or leadership. By Thursday evening, I'd received more than a dozen similar calls and messages, creating a picture of community impact that went far beyond what the financial documents could show. Grandma had built something that mattered to people's daily lives, something that represented hope and opportunity in a town that had struggled economically for decades. The support was encouraging, but it also made me more aware of the responsibility I'd inherited. These people weren't just expressing gratitude for past assistance, they were counting on the Foundation's continued support for projects and programs that might not exist without its funding. Richard's suggestion that I was too young and inexperienced to handle such responsibility suddenly felt less like an insult and more like a legitimate concern. Friday morning brought a registered letter from Morrison, Blackwell and Associates, the law firm Linda's cousin worked for. The letter was formally written but clear in its intent. Richard was requesting a complete audit of the Dorothy Sullivan Community Foundation's financial records, management decisions, and establishment procedures. The firm was also seeking medical records related to Dorothy Mitchell's mental state during the final months of her life. The letter stopped short of filing an actual lawsuit, but it represented the first formal step in what would obviously be a protracted legal battle. Richard was moving exactly as Grandma had predicted, challenging the Foundation's legitimacy by questioning her competence and my qualifications to continue her work. I spent Friday afternoon calling Margaret Chen's office and scheduling a meeting for the following Monday. Her secretary seemed familiar with the general situation, suggesting that Mr. Parker had already been in contact with Grandma's recommended legal team. The machinery of defense that Grandma had so carefully constructed was beginning to engage, responding to Richard's challenge with the kind of thorough preparation that reflected years of strategic thinking. That evening, I returned to Grandma's journal, reading through her observations about Richard's character and her predictions about how he would respond to learning about the Foundation. Her accuracy was unsettling, as if she'd been able to see into the future and prepare for conflicts that hadn't yet materialized. One entry from 2 years ago was particularly prescient. Richard stopped by today to discuss my financial situation, meaning he wants to know exactly what I'm worth and how I'm planning to distribute it. He suggested I should consolidate my assets to make things simpler for whoever has to handle my estate. When I mentioned that I'd already made all the necessary arrangements, he got that look he used to get as a child when someone had a toy he wanted but couldn't have. The comparison to childhood behavior was both accurate and sad, revealing Grandma's understanding that Richard's adult personality had grown from seeds planted decades earlier. His assumption that family wealth should naturally flow to him wasn't based on merit or need, it was the persistence of childish entitlement that had never been properly challenged or corrected. As I prepared for bed that Friday night, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me from feeling like the family's forgotten afterthought to becoming the center of a legal battle over millions of dollars. The brass key still sat on my bedside table, a tangible reminder of the secrets Grandma had hidden and the trust she'd placed in my ability to protect what she'd built. The real test was just beginning, but for the first time since this whole situation had started, I felt ready for whatever Richard might throw at me. Grandma Dorothy had given me more than money or property. She'd given me knowledge, preparation, and the kind of thorough documentation that would be difficult for any court to dismiss. The Foundation belonged to the community, and I belonged to the Foundation. Richard could challenge that reality all he wanted, but he was fighting against the wishes of a woman who'd understood him better than he understood himself, and who'd planned her defense accordingly. Parts 10 Bus 14. The unexpected contact through victory and vindication. Monday morning's meeting with Margaret Chen took place in a downtown Columbus office that radiated the kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of successful legal practice. The building was older but well maintained, with marble floors and brass fixtures that suggested tradition and stability. Chen herself was a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes and the kind of direct manner that probably intimidated opposing counsel on a regular basis. Your grandmother was quite remarkable, Chen said, as she
Reviewed the foundation documents spread across her conference table. I've been practicing estate law for 25 years, and I've rarely seen this level of strategic planning from someone who wasn't a professional attorney or financial planner. She explained that Grandma Dorothy had first contacted her firm 3 years earlier, not to create the foundation, but to ensure its legal structure would withstand exactly the kind of challenge Richard was now mounting. Every document had been reviewed by multiple specialists. Every decision had been documented with supporting evidence, and every potential vulnerability had been addressed through careful preparation. The Morrison firm is known for aggressive tactics, Chen continued, but they typically succeed only when the estate planning was sloppy or the deceased showed clear signs of diminished capacity. Your grandmother's case is the opposite. She demonstrated consistent competence over years of complex financial decisions, and she documented her reasoning for every choice she made. Chen opened a thick folder that contained correspondence between her firm and Grandma Dorothy dating back years. The letters revealed a woman who asked detailed questions about legal precedents, who researched successful foundation structures, and who insisted on understanding every aspect of the strategies being used to protect her legacy. Dorothy was particularly concerned about challenges based on your age and perceived inexperience, Chen said. She specifically requested that we research cases where young foundation directors had successfully defended their positions against family challenges. The precedents are actually quite favorable, especially when the young person has been mentored and prepared for the responsibility. The meeting lasted 3 hours, with Chen walking me through the legal strategy Grandma had developed and the resources available to implement it. There were character witnesses ready to testify about Grandma's mental acuity during her final months, financial experts prepared to demonstrate the soundness of her investment decisions, and community leaders willing to speak about the foundation's positive impact on Riverside. The most important thing you need to understand, Chen said as we concluded the meeting, is that this isn't really about you or your qualifications. This is about honoring your grandmother's right to dispose of her property according to her own wishes. Richard's challenge isn't based on your unfitness, it's based on his assumption that he deserved something he was never promised. The drive back to Riverside gave me time to process everything I'd learned about the legal battle ahead. Chen had been confident about our chances, but she'd also been clear that family disputes over significant assets could become emotionally brutal, especially when they involved challenges to someone's mental competence. Richard wasn't just questioning my ability to manage the foundation, he was essentially accusing his own mother of being incapable of making rational decisions. Tuesday brought an unexpected call from David Chen, the financial advisor who'd been working with Grandma on the foundation's investments. He asked if I could meet him at the Riverside Community Bank, where he wanted to show me something that might be relevant to the legal challenges I was facing. The bank's president, Martha Williams, greeted us personally and led us to a private conference room where she'd assembled files dating back 15 years. Williams was a woman in her 60s who'd known Grandma Dorothy since childhood, and her respect for my grandmother was evident in every word she spoke. "Your grandmother was one of our most sophisticated clients," Williams said as she opened the first folder. She understood market trends, evaluated risk carefully, and made investment decisions that consistently outperformed our standard recommendations. There was never any question about her mental sharpness or financial competence. The files contained detailed records of every transaction Grandma had made through the bank, along with notes from meetings where she discussed her investment strategies and long-term goals. Williams had apparently documented these conversations as part of the bank's normal procedures, creating a paper trail that would be difficult for Richard's attorneys to dismiss. What really impressed me about Dorothy, Williams continued, was her focus on community impact alongside financial returns. She could have made more money investing in larger markets or more aggressive funds, but she consistently chose investments that would benefit Riverside directly or indirectly. David Chen spread out financial statements showing the foundation's performance over the past decade. The numbers were impressive by any standard, with steady growth that reflected careful planning rather than lucky speculation. The foundation's assets had more than doubled during the period when Richard would later claim Grandma was losing her mental faculties. These records will be crucial if the Morrison firm tries to argue that Dorothy's financial decisions were irrational or influenced by outside manipulation. Chen explained, "They show a consistent pattern of sophisticated decision-making that continued right up until her final hospital stay." Williams nodded in agreement. "I actually met with Dorothy just 6 weeks before she passed away. She wanted to review the foundation's quarterly reports and discuss some potential property acquisitions. Her mind was as sharp as ever, and she was making plans for projects that wouldn't come to fruition for years. The meeting reinforced my growing understanding of how thoroughly Grandma had prepared for the battle that was now unfolding. She hadn't just created legal protections, she'd built relationships with professionals who could testify credibly about her competence and intentions. Every aspect of her planning had been designed to withstand the kind of scrutiny that family challenges typically brought." Wednesday evening brought a phone call that changed the entire dynamic of the legal dispute. Linda's voice was tight with barely controlled emotion when she asked if I could come to their house immediately for an urgent family discussion. Her tone suggested that something significant had happened, something that couldn't wait for a more convenient time. I found Richard pacing around his living room like a caged animal, his face flushed with anger and frustration. Linda sat on the edge of the sofa with her hands folded tightly in her lap, looking like she'd been crying. The atmosphere was charged with the kind of tension that comes from discovering something that changes everything you thought you understood. "Tell her," Linda said to Richard, her voice flat and exhausted. "Tell her what your expensive attorneys found when they started digging into Mom's medical records." Richard stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression a mixture of anger and something that looked almost like shame. "The Morrison firm hired a private investigator to research Mom's activities during her final year. They wanted to find evidence that she wasn't thinking clearly, or that someone was influencing her decisions inappropriately." He sat down heavily in his leather recliner, suddenly looking older than his 55 years. What they found instead was documentation of every meeting she had with attorneys, financial advisors, and medical professionals. Complete records of her mental competency evaluations, cognitive function tests, and psychological assessments. Linda picked up the story with the kind of exhausted precision that suggested she'd been rehearsing these facts in her mind. Dorothy had herself evaluated by 3 different specialists during her final year, specifically to document her mental state for legal purposes. She scored in the top percentile for cognitive function in her age group. Every test, every evaluation, every professional opinion confirms that she was completely competent right up until the end. The implications were staggering. Grandma hadn't just anticipated Richard's challenge to her mental competence, she'd proactively gathered evidence to disprove it. She'd undergone psychological testing specifically to create documentation that would protect the foundation from exactly the kind of attack Richard was attempting. "There's more," Richard said grimly. The investigator also found records of Mom's correspondence with community leaders, business owners, and local officials. She'd been discussing the foundation's work openly for years, getting input and advice from dozens of people who can testify about her clarity and judgment. I sat in stunned silence as Richard continued to outline what the private investigator had uncovered. Far from finding evidence of a confused elderly woman making irrational decisions, the investigation had revealed a master strategist who'd spent years building an unassailable case for her own competence and the wisdom of her choices. "The Morrison firm says we don't have a case," Linda said quietly. "They're recommending that we withdraw the challenge before it goes to court and becomes public record." Apparently, proceeding would just create a platform for demonstrating how thoroughly Dorothy planned for this exact situation. Richard's hands were clenched into fists, his jaw tight with the kind of frustrated anger that comes from realizing you've been outmaneuvered by someone you'd underestimated. She knew Sarah. She knew exactly what I would do, and she prepared for all of it. Every move I've made, every strategy I've considered, she anticipated and planned countermeasures. The admission was painful for him. I could see that. Richard had built his identity around being the smartest person in the room, the family member who understood business and financial matters better than anyone else. Discovering that his elderly mother had outthought him at every turn was a blow to his ego that would probably take years to recover from. So what happens now? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Linda looked at Richard, waiting for him to respond, but he seemed incapable of speech. Finally, she answered for both of them. Now we accept that Dorothy made her choices for reasons we might not understand but can't legitimately challenge. The foundation is yours, Sarah, exactly as she intended. The conversation that followed was subdued and awkward, with Richard struggling to come to terms with the reality that his mother had been several steps ahead of him throughout this entire process. He asked a few questions about my plans for the foundation, but his heart clearly wasn't in the discussion. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a kind of bewildered respect for the woman he thought he'd understood completely. I left their house that evening feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the legal challenge was ending before it could tear the family apart permanently, but sadness that it had taken this confrontation for Richard to begin understanding who his mother really was. Grandma Dorothy had won her final battle, but the victory felt hollow because it had required proving that the people who should have known her best had actually known her least. Thursday morning brought a call from Mr. Parker asking if I could come to his office to sign some final paperwork related to the foundation's legal status. The Morrison firm had formally withdrawn their challenge, and there were administrative details that needed to be resolved to close the matter permanently. Your grandmother would be proud, Parker said as I signed the last document. She spent years preparing for this outcome, but I don't think she took any pleasure in anticipating conflict with her own family. She just wanted to ensure that her life's work would continue according to her values. Parker handed me a final envelope that had been sealed and marked for opening only after the legal challenge was resolved. Inside was a brief note in Grandma's handwriting. Sarah, if you're reading this, then you've proven yourself worthy of the trust I placed in you. The foundation is now truly yours to lead. Use it wisely, and remember that the best legacy is the one that makes other people's lives better. The note continued with specific suggestions about community projects the foundation might support and relationships I should cultivate with local leaders and organizations. Even in this final communication, Grandma was thinking ahead, providing guidance for challenges and opportunities that hadn't yet materialized. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to my apartment. Richard stood at my door with a bottle of wine and an expression that mixed apology with something that might have been newfound respect. He looked different somehow, less imposing and more human than I'd seen him in years. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. Several apologies, actually. I underestimated Mom, I underestimated you, and I let my own assumptions about family hierarchy blind me to what was really happening. I invited him in, and we sat at my small kitchen table drinking wine while he tried to articulate thoughts that were clearly difficult for him to express. Richard had spent his entire adult life believing that success in business qualified him to make decisions for other family members, that age and gender created natural hierarchies that shouldn't be questioned. Mom saw through all of that, he said after his second glass of wine had loosened his tongue slightly. She understood that I'd never accept your authority if I thought it came from sentiment or favoritism, so she made sure it came from competence and preparation instead. The conversation continued for more than 2 hours, with Richard gradually revealing aspects of his relationship with Grandma that he'd never discussed before. He'd always felt pressure to live up to her expectations, to prove himself worthy of being her eldest son and presumed heir. What he'd never realized was that she'd been evaluating his character all along, watching to see if success would make him more generous or more selfish. I failed that test, he admitted as the evening wound down. I became the kind of person who assumes that having money means deserving power, that being successful in business means being qualified to make decisions for other people.
Mom knew that about me, and she planned accordingly. Richard's visit marked the beginning of a different relationship between us, one based on mutual respect rather than family hierarchy. He began stopping by occasionally to ask about the Foundation's projects, offering advice when I requested it but never assuming that his opinions should carry more weight than my own judgment. The legal challenge had ended, but its resolution created opportunities for the Foundation's work that I hadn't anticipated. The investigation Richard's attorneys had conducted had inadvertently publicized the Foundation's existence and impact throughout Riverside, creating awareness that led to new partnerships and funding opportunities. Local businesses began approaching the Foundation about collaborative projects, and community organizations that had struggled with funding found new hope in the Foundation's mission. The Riverside City Council formally recognized the Foundation's contributions to downtown revitalization and economic development, creating opportunities for larger-scale projects that could transform the entire community. 6 months after the legal challenge ended, I stood on the construction site where the Foundation was building Riverside's new community center and job training facility. The project represented everything Grandma Dorothy had envisioned: practical assistance for people who needed it, economic development that benefited the entire community, and collaboration between public and private resources. The community center would house educational programs, small business incubators, and social services that had previously been scattered across multiple locations. More importantly, it would serve as a symbol of what could be accomplished when people work together toward common goals rather than competing for individual advantage. Richard and Linda attended the groundbreaking ceremony, standing with Dad and me as local officials spoke about the project's importance to Riverside's future. Richard looked proud but subdued, still adjusting to his new role as a supporter rather than a leader of family initiatives. The experience had humbled him in ways that were probably ultimately beneficial, even if they'd been painful to endure. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a bronze plaque that would be permanently installed at the community center's entrance. The inscription read, "The Dorothy Mitchell Community Center, funded by the Dorothy Sullivan Foundation in honor of a woman who understood that true wealth comes from lifting others up." As I read those words aloud to the assembled crowd, I thought about the journey that had brought me from feeling like the family's forgotten afterthought to standing here as the director of an organization that was changing lives throughout Riverside. Grandma Dorothy had given me more than money or property; she'd given me purpose and the tools to make a difference. The champagne toast that had started this whole story seemed like something from another lifetime, a memory of people who thought they understood how power and wealth should be distributed. Richard's celebration of my supposed exclusion had been based on assumptions about family hierarchy that Grandma had spent years quietly undermining. Now, as I watched community members touring the construction site and discussing the programs they hoped to see offered in the new facility, I understood what Grandma had really left me. It wasn't just a foundation or a collection of properties or even a substantial amount of money. It was the opportunity to continue her work of building something larger than any individual family, something that would benefit generations of Riverside residents who hadn't even been born yet. The legal challenge had tested my resolve and forced me to understand the full scope of my responsibilities, but it had also revealed the strength of the foundation Grandma had built. Her careful planning had protected not just the financial assets but the mission and values that made those assets meaningful. That evening, Dad and I had dinner at Murphy's Diner, sitting in the same booth where we'd discussed the foundation months earlier when everything had seemed uncertain and overwhelming. The conversation now was different, focused on future projects and opportunities rather than family conflicts and legal challenges. "Mom would be proud of what you've accomplished," Dad said as we shared a piece of Mrs. Murphy's famous apple pie. "Not just with the foundation but with how you've handled everything that came with it. She knew you had the character for this kind of responsibility, even when the rest of us couldn't see it." I thought about the brass key that still sat in my jewelry box, the key that had unlocked not just a drawer but an understanding of who Grandma Dorothy really was. She'd been so much more than the sweet elderly woman who grew roses and organized church potlucks. She'd been a visionary who understood that lasting change required patient planning and careful preparation. The foundation would continue growing and evolving, supporting new projects and responding to changing community needs. But the principles Grandma had built into its structure would remain constant: the belief that wealth should serve community welfare, that power should be earned through service rather than inherited through family position, and that the best legacy is the one that makes other people's lives better. Richard's attempt to challenge the foundation had ultimately strengthened it by forcing a public examination of Grandma's competence and intentions. The investigation he'd commissioned had created a documentary record of her wisdom and foresight that would protect the foundation's mission for decades to come. As I walked home through downtown Riverside that evening, I passed building after building that the foundation owned or had helped to revitalize. The streetlights illuminated sidewalks where families strolled safely, past shops and restaurants that employed hundreds of local residents, through a community that was thriving because one woman had understood the difference between having wealth and using wealth wisely. The champagne toast that had celebrated my exclusion had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what really mattered. Richard and his family had thought they were toasting their inheritance of Grandma's house and antique shop, but they'd actually been celebrating their own failure to understand what true legacy looks like. Grandma Dorothy's inheritance couldn't be measured in dollars or divided among family members. It was the ongoing work of building community, creating opportunity, and ensuring that prosperity lifted everyone rather than concentrating benefits among a fortunate few. She'd entrusted that inheritance to me not because I was special or deserving, but because she'd believed I could learn to carry it forward with the same combination of practical wisdom and genuine care that had guided her own efforts. The foundation would outlive all of us, continuing its work long after the current family conflicts were forgotten and the people involved in this story had become history themselves. That continuity was the real victory, the proof that Grandma Dorothy's planning had succeeded in creating something larger and more durable than any individual's ambitions or disappointments. Walking up the steps to my apartment, I felt the weight of responsibility but also the satisfaction that comes from knowing your work matters to people beyond yourself. The foundation was no longer just Grandma's legacy, it was becoming mine as well, shaped by her wisdom but adapted to new challenges and opportunities that she could never have anticipated completely. The brass key had unlocked more than hidden documents. It had revealed a path forward that honored the past while building toward a future that would benefit people I'd never meet in ways I couldn't yet imagine. That was the real inheritance, the one that couldn't be challenged in court or divided among family members, the one that grew stronger through use rather than weaker through sharing. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.